Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this very important webinar on properly managing e-cigarettes and vaping waste streams. My name is Martin Suberg. I am the Executive Director of the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, NEWMOA, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this great presentation. As you can tell, you are on the GoToWebinar platform. All participants except our panelists are muted during the presentation. The webinar is being recorded, and a copy of this recording will be made available after the presentation, along with the materials that the presenters are providing. As I noted, you are on mute right now, or the way we ordinarily conduct these webinars is for our presenters to go through their presentations. We will leave about 30 minutes for questions at the end of the program. The way you ask questions is there is a question button on your screen. Type the question in. I will be monitoring the questions and feeding them to the presenters. We will try to make sure that we get as many questions as possible, addressed during the program. We will start with some brief introductions and then go right into the program. It is my pleasure to welcome first Michael Tynan, a public health analyst and policy team lead at the Center for Disease Control's Office on Smoking and Health. Michael works as a subject matter expert on tobacco policy issues such as tobacco prices, tobacco use in popular media, smoke-free policies, and cannabis tobacco overlap. He previously served as the policy director with the Oregon Public Health Division, where he worked on various public health issues and led the development of public health administrative rules on cannabis legislation. He has a master's degree in public health from the University of Washington in Seattle. After Michael, we will hear from Kristin Fitzgerald from the US EPA. Kristin has been working at EPA since 2001, working primarily on sector-based rulemakings for hazardous waste generators. Kristin started working with the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA, over 30 years ago, answering questions on the RCRA Superfund hotline. She holds a BA in government from St. Lawrence University in New York and a master's of Science and Environmental Science and Policy from George Mason University in Virginia. She is joined also by Patrick Wise, a program analyst at the US EPA offices in Washington, D.C. Our third presenter is Don Stillwaugh. Don has worked in Florida for Pinellas County government for over 20 years and has been an environmental compliance inspector for the county's solid waste development department for the past 13 years. Prior to that, he worked for the county's Environmental Lands Division, studying everything from shorebirds and butterflies to orchids and lilies. Though originally from the Chicago area, he now works in Florida as a field biologist on numerous prairie and savanna remnants. Away from work, he is the treasurer of the not-for-profit Gopher Tortoise Council. So once again, I want to very much thank all four of our panelists, I should say, for all three of their presentations. And we will begin with Michael Tynan. So Michael, I'm about to give you the controls, and you may begin your presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, and you can see my screen okay?
Yes.
We're good to go? Okay, great. Hi, I'm, as you heard earlier, Michael Tynan. I'm a policy team lead in the Office on Smoking and Health at CDC. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna briefly walk through some background on e-cigarettes and put in some framework on why we're talking about these products from a public health perspective. So before I do that, I want to highlight that cigarette smoking remains the leading preventable cause of death and disease in the US. Life expectancy for smokers is about 10 years shorter than that of non-smokers. And quitting before age 40 reduces your risk of dying from a smoking-related disease by about 90%. While 480,000 people are going to die this year from smoking, that isn't the only risk. For every person who dies from tobacco use, there's another 30 who continue to live with and suffer from tobacco-related illnesses. This chart shows the last 120 years of the history of cigarette consumption in the United States, which you can see here rose through the first two world wars, which included a period when soldiers were given cigarettes in their rations, and then they came home from the war and they shared their nicotine addiction with their spouses. This increase in consumption also coincided with an area where tobacco products were heavily marketed, both on television and promoted by celebrities, not only in film, but also on TV. While a link to the disease was initially established in the 1950s, use peaked around the same time period when we released the first Surgeon General's report on smoking in 1964, which then was followed by a new era of public health interventions, which included things like raising the price, a broadcasting ban of marketing on television, policies to protect people from secondhand smoke, counter marketing campaigns, and more recently, the regulations that were established by Congress, giving the Food and Drug Administration the authority to regulate tobacco products. So while that's the history of cigarettes, in our more recent history, the tobacco product landscape has really evolved beyond the analog, combustible, and smokeless tobacco products that were used by consumers for the better part of the 20th century. What we have now is a wide variety of products, which include electronic cigarettes and heated tobacco products that have come on to the market this century. And so if we look at electronic cigarette devices, there's really been an evolution over time with the different products that are out there. And so when the first products were introduced in the later part of the 2000s, in the late 2000s, the first generation of electronic cigarette devices really looked like a cigarette. Some of the devices going as far to have a red lit tip at the end, so it looked just like a cigarette. These products were typically disposable. Then we moved into the second generation, which were where we started to see products that were would either be would have a pod that you could put in there to replace the e-cigarette liquid, and were rechargeable. Then by the third generation, we had refillable, modifiable products, and then the fourth generation, which are the ones that are the most used products now, were when we started to begin to see products that were more like USB devices, were pod or cartridge based, could be refillable. Initially, they were rechargeable and refillable, and then the more popular products in recent years have transitioned to being disposable products again. So we're seeing some evolution of the types of products that are available in the market and the ones that are most commonly used. So the reason why this is important for public health is because of what we know about e-cigarette use. Most adults don't use e-cigarettes. Less than 4% of adults use e-cigarettes. Most adult tobacco users are cigarette smokers. However, as you can see here, among youth, e-cigarettes have been the most popular or the most commonly used tobacco product since 2014. And if we drill down into that, we're looking at today about 14.1% of youth who use e-cigarettes, compared to just about 2% who smoke cigarettes and about 3% who use cigars. Now, there are reasons for this, which is a whole nother public talk altogether, that includes looking at the availability of flavorings, or the type of marketing or exposure that youth have to promotional campaigns. Now, from a public health perspective, this is important because nearly all e-cigarettes contain nicotine, which Kristin will talk about a little bit later. Nicotine is highly addictive and is particularly harmful to youth. Nicotine exposure during adolescence can harm the developing brain, and the brain continues to develop until about age 25. And using nicotine in adolescence can also harm the part of the brain that controls attention, learning, mood, impulse control. And if you think about those fourth generation of electronic products that I showed, products like Juul, or like Soren, or Puff Bar, that was when a new form of nicotine salts began to be used, which nicotine salts have a lower pH than free-base nicotine, which allows particularly high levels of nicotine to be inhaled more easily with less irritation to the throat than free-base nicotine. So it allowed young or novice users to to absorb or to ingest higher levels of nicotine and much easier. So besides nicotine, e-cigarette aerosol also contains other products. It contains cancer-causing chemicals, heavy metals, ultrafine particles that can be inhaled deeply into the lungs and harm your body. Again, e-cigarette aerosol is not harmless and it's not water vapor. And even though e-cigarette aerosol generally contains fewer harmful chemicals than regular analog cigarettes, safer doesn't mean safe. Additionally, the flavorings in e-cigarettes aren't necessarily safe. The gut can handle a lot more than the lungs, and so some of the flavorings in e-liquids may not be safe when inhaled. Scientists are still working to understand fully the long-term and full health effects of and harmful doses of e-cigarette content when they're heated and turned into an aerosol. So there's a lot that that we don't know about these products. So the point of going through this is to frame why the public health community is concerned about e-cigarettes among youth and why we may be seeing e-cigarette waste that needs to be disposed of in places like schools, or that need to be collected in municipal parks or on beaches, and why we need to educate people, which include parents, pediatricians, educators, education administrators from these sectors and from other sectors about the environmental impact of this waste and these products. So I'm going to hand it off to Kristin, who's going to talk about the regulatory considerations as we start to think about addressing the environmental impact of the waste from these products.
Thank you very much. Kristin, you should be able to manage the screen now.
Great. So I have a landline still, and it decided to ring the moment you told me I could get online. So luckily, nobody's leaving me a message. Okay, that's good. All right, so good afternoon, everybody. I am so happy that NEWMOA decided to devote an entire webinar to this this waste stream that I've been giving, and Michael has been giving talks on, and Don's been inspecting for a long time. A lot of the focus up until now, I think rightly so, has been about how e-cigarette use affects public health, right? So the use of the products affecting public health, that makes sense, that a lot of our focus has been on that. But as waste professionals, I think we understand that the disposal of an item, which is often an afterthought, unfortunately, disposal of the item also has its own public health considerations. So thank you to NEWMOA for doing this webinar. So I'll start by discussing the RCRA status of e-cigarettes and components. I'll explain safety concerns related to e-cigarette batteries in particular. I will briefly discuss residential disposal, but I'll mainly focus on non-residential disposal, including disposal by schools, since the majority of questions that we get at EPA headquarters are actually related to disposal by schools. And then finally, I'll address recycling of e-cigarette batteries. Okay, so there are, as Michael said, there are many styles of e-cigarettes, but all e-cigarettes have a few things in common, and two of those things that they have in common are they all have e-liquids, and almost always, but not all the time, almost always the e-liquids include nicotine, and they all have a battery, and that's usually a lithium battery. So I'll cover the RCRA status of both of those, but starting with e-liquids. So e-liquids, some people call them e-juices, although I really don't like that term. It's a little nauseating. So e-liquids with nicotine are RCRA hazardous waste. In fact, they're acute hazardous waste because nicotine is listed as an acute hazardous waste. And that's because nicotine is the sole active ingredient in the e-liquids. And we have a RCRA online memo about that back from 2015 when e-cigarettes were still relatively new. And although e-cigarettes are still relatively new, the RCRA regulations for nicotine actually is not new. Nicotine was listed as an acute hazardous waste for toxicity way back in 1980, way before e-cigarettes were around, and that's when the first RCRA regulations were promulgated. And then in 2019, we reaffirmed the acute toxicity of nicotine in a subsequent rulemaking. Slide is not advancing. All right, I cannot get the slide to advance.
Okay, let me see what we can do here. If you like, I can try to share from mine while you continue to narrate.
I actually changed the slides a little bit since I shared them with
Okay.
you. So
Okay.
I don't even, oh, wait,
now
okay.
Now it's moving.
Okay, I did that with my mouse, that worked. Okay, that's good.
Okay.
Okay, so the other thing that all e-cigarettes have in common is a battery. And like I said, it's typically a lithium battery. Now, some e-cigarettes, as Michael mentioned, are disposable. They're just meant as a one-time use e-cigarette. And those have lithium metal batteries, sometimes also called primary batteries, and those are not rechargeable batteries. And some e-cigarettes are designed to be reused, and those have lithium-ion batteries that are rechargeable. Now, in both cases, those lithium batteries are likely to be RCRA hazardous waste as both ignitable hazardous waste with D001 waste code and reactive hazardous waste with the D003 waste code. Now, you've probably actually know this intuitively, even if you hadn't thought about it in the RCRA context, because you've probably heard about like the Samsung phone recall back in 2016. That was due to their batteries. And TSA now prohibits lithium battery packs and e-cigarettes in checked luggage. So you got to ask yourself, why is that? And it's because of the batteries and their unfortunate habit of causing fires. I recently saw a talk given by a New York City firefighter who is spending a lot of his effort on e-cigarette, or not just e-cigarette, but lithium batteries. And he actually said in New York City alone, lithium batteries are causing 2 to 5 fires every day. So if the e-cigarette components are both hazardous waste, obviously the e-cigarettes themselves are too. It's a little bit of an unusual waste stream in that it's got acute components as well as non-acute components. So the concern over the e-cigarette fires has actually been so great that FEMA, they have a organization within FEMA called the Fire Administration. They've done 2 reports about e-cigarette batteries, and they have some very memorable quotables in that report. And I don't usually read from slides, but I think in this case it's worth it. They say that the combination of electronic cigarette and a lithium-ion battery is a new and unique hazard. There's no analogy among consumer products to the risk of a severe acute injury presented by an e-cigarette. They also say that fires or explosions caused by the batteries used in electronic cigarettes are uncommon. However, the consequences can be devastating and life-altering for the victims. And third, this one's my favorite, the shape and construction of electronic cigarettes can make them behave like flaming rockets when a battery fails. Who doesn't want that in their pocket? So fires caused by lithium batteries have also become a top concern in the waste management industry. This is a little hard to tell probably, but it's a photo of a garbage truck that had to dump out its load onto the middle of the road because a lithium-ion battery had caught fire inside the garbage truck. So as we're moving on to talk about, the RCRA regulations for disposal of e-cigarettes, let me first address residential disposal. So I just said that e-cigarettes and their components are hazardous waste, but disposal of e-cigarettes at residences, even though they're hazardous waste, it's not regulated by EPA as hazardous waste. Why is that? It's because there's a household hazardous waste exemption. So hazardous waste that we all generate in our homes is not regulated. So I will say we have recommendations about how to handle the e-cigarettes from your home, even though they're not regulated. And one is, do not put them, I just showed you the picture of the garbage truck, so don't put them in your household garbage. Likewise, don't put them in your curbside recycling bins. What we do recommend is that household hazardous waste, it's got hazardous in there in the title, it's still hazardous, so we recommend that you bring it to a household hazardous waste collection program. They're usually run by your county or municipality. It's free, and that way it'll be diverted away from the municipal waste garbage trucks and the landfills, and it'll be managed appropriately as hazardous waste. So a note of caution, I am referring to the federal regulations throughout this presentation, and some states are more stringent and actually do regulate household hazardous waste. Okay, so if you personally or someone you know has e-cigarettes, the main takeaway is don't put them in your garbage, don't put them in your recycling bin, bring them to household hazardous waste collection. So let's turn to non-residential disposal. So e-cigarettes and their components are regulated as RCRA hazardous waste when they're discarded at sites that are not residences. So both that acute component and the non-acute component have to be considered when calculating the site's RCRA generator category. Right? So for the lithium batteries, you're looking at your non-acute hazardous waste thresholds, and because of the nicotine, for the e-liquids, you're looking at the acute hazardous waste thresholds. And as this chart shows, when you're dealing with acute hazardous waste, you don't have to generate very much to become a large quantity generator. It's just got to be 1 kilogram a month, and you're a large quantity generator. So because I love a spreadsheet and love making these calculations, I did some back of the envelope calculations for e-cigarette components, for kind of a learning aid and guesstimating one's RCRA generator category. So for e-liquids, that acute hazardous waste threshold, right, is 1 kilogram. So how much does it take to exceed that 1 kilogram of acute hazardous waste and actually become an LQG? So for a long time, Juuls dominated the youth use of e-cigarettes, and so that's why I kind of looked up and focused on Juuls. And they have about a milliliter, just under a milliliter of e-liquid in them when they're new. And so it would take about roughly 1,000 Juul pods to exceed a kilogram of acute hazardous waste. But of course, if you're dealing with the vials that the e-juice comes in, if you're using refillable e-cigarettes and you've got vials of nicotine, that adds up a lot faster. And so sometimes they come in 5 milliliter vials, sometimes bigger. But if you're dealing with a smaller, like eye drop size bottle, it would take about 200 full vials to get to a kilogram. Then if you flip to the lithium battery side, how many does it take to exceed 100 kilograms of a non-acute hazardous waste and kick you into SQG status, small quantity generator status? And again, I looked at a battery that's in common usage. It's the 18650 lithium-ion battery. It would take about 2,000 of those batteries in order to exceed 100 kilograms. Now, I need to put a big asterisk next to this. The 18650 is very commonly used, but it really shouldn't be. They're manufactured as part of battery packs. But what happens is people take those packs apart and sell them individually as individual batteries to consumers online, despite the fact that CPA has issued a warning against doing that. Right, so they are out there, e-cigarettes. You find them in e-cigarettes, but they really shouldn't be. So as I mentioned, we do get a lot of questions about disposal of e-cigarettes at schools. And that's, because schools have been confiscating e-cigarettes from students and finding them in, bathrooms and out in the parking lots and everything, and then they're stuck trying to figure out what to do with them. So let me start by saying that EPA does not consider a school to be a household or a residence, and therefore the school is not eligible to use the household hazardous waste exemption. So they have to manage them as hazardous waste along with other hazardous waste that the school generates. Right? So like all let me back up a second. So one of the criteria for determining whether something meets the household hazardous waste criteria is that the waste has to be generated on the premises of a residence. That's why we don't consider a school to be a household, to be eligible for the household hazardous waste exemption. So like all generators, whether and how a school is regulated for disposal depends on how much they generate on a calendar month. What we call their RCRA generator category. And when they're determining that RCRA generator category, the school has to count all their hazardous waste that it generates each month, not just their e-cigarettes. So, that math that I just gave you is useful as a guide, but that's not the only thing you're counting, right? You have to count all the other sources of hazardous waste at the school. And there's lots of different places that a school might generate hazardous waste depending upon the size of the school and what their specialty is. So I'm going to go through two scenarios for how a school should manage its hazardous waste. One, if a school is a very small quantity generator, and then if a school is not a very small quantity generator. And though, I'm saying schools, then how the school should manage it, it applies to disposal by other non-residences as well. So the first scenario is if the school is a VSQG, a very small quantity generator. And EPA expects that, many smaller schools would be VSQGs. And if they are, we've got a couple of different recommendations that they could use. One is that we encourage the VSQGs to contact their small business collection program to inquire about whether they are collecting e-cigarettes as part of that program. So these small business collection programs are often run at the same location by the same people that run the household hazardous waste collection program. But when they're operating on behalf of small businesses, there's usually a fee. Sometimes the days that they run them are, fewer, maybe less frequent than if for households. But reach out and see if they're collecting e-cigarettes. The second alternative that we recommend for VSQG is that there are new regulations that allow VSQGs to send their hazardous waste off-site to a large quantity generator. And then that large quantity generator manages that hazardous waste on their behalf, right? So there's a lot of ifs, ands, or buts associated with this offsite consolidation provision. I'm not going to go through all of those, but let me just say that one of those conditions is that the large quantity generator that's going to be receiving the hazardous waste from offsite has to be under the same control of the VSQG. Right, basically has to be the same entity, the same person as we refer to it as under RCRA. So with the school situation, that might be like a central location within the school district that could consolidate them from all the schools that are VSQGs in the central location and manage them as hazardous waste. But you also have to be careful. This provision has to be in effect in your state. The good news is that actually it's 45 out of 56 states and territories, the generator improvements rule is now in effect. So it's more states than not that can take advantage of this. Sorry. So the second scenario is if the school is not a VSQG, not a very small quantity generator, and is instead a small quantity generator or even a large quantity generator. So EPA expects that larger schools would not be VSQGs, and if that's the case, then those small business collection days are not an option for them. The small business days are only set up to collect waste from very small quantity generators. So in that case, the confiscated e-cigarettes have to be managed along with all the rest of the school's hazardous waste. They're subject to the same RCRA cradle-to-grave management standards that apply to all the rest of their hazardous waste. Starting with the very first step of having an EPA ID number. And then the school system, or probably not the individual school, but the school system should then have a hazardous waste vendor that's going to transport the waste off-site and treat it and dispose of it appropriately as hazardous waste. So regardless of the RCRA generator category of the school or the business, given those hazards of the e-cigarettes that we were talking about, I really think it's imperative that those collected e-cigarettes are stored in a safe manner prior to transportation and disposal. So the DOT regulations, the Department of Transportation regulations, so DOT has specific regulations for lithium batteries. Okay? And technically those don't apply, or excuse me, technically those only apply during transportation. But we recommend that folks use those prior to transportation during storage. We also recommend that anybody handling the e-cigarettes, collecting them from, out in the parking lot or wherever they're collecting them from, whoever's doing that should wear chemical resistant gloves when they're handling the e-cigarettes. Nicotine absorbs dermally and it is toxic. So wear nitrile or latex gloves to protect yourselves. So when it comes to batteries, the main goal for storing them safely is to prevent fires. So how do you achieve that goal? You want to avoid damaging the battery and you want to isolate the terminals. The good news is that the methods for preventing fires involve materials that we're all familiar with, are inexpensive and widely available. So let's just cover the first column there, methods for preventing damage to the batteries. You want to store the batteries away from a heat source in a climate controlled area. And you don't, like I said earlier, you don't want to put them in the trash or the curbside recycling because they're more likely to get punctured or crushed in that scenario. So moving on to the second column, methods for isolating the battery terminals, again, very easy, right? You want to take each individual battery or each individual e-cigarette and put it in a separate clear plastic bag that's sealed, like a Ziploc bag, right? Put it in there, zip it up, it's isolated, those terminals are isolated, right? The other way to do that is to tape the terminals of the battery with a non-conductive tape, okay? So there's certain tapes that are non-conductive and you want to make sure you're using those. You really need to be careful if you run into a battery that's bulging or leaking. Those are referred to DOT, Department of Transportation refers to those as DDR batteries. That stands for damaged, defective, or recalled batteries. And those are particularly dangerous. If you have one of those, put them in a bucket of water or sand to contain a potential fire. To be clear, what I mean is that you put the DDR battery in the water or sand before the fire, because you certainly don't want to have to pick it up and put it in the bucket of water or sand while it's on fire. So put it in there if you have a leaking or bulging battery prior to the fire. Here are some photos from the DOT website about DDR batteries. So the one on the left is like a pouch battery that you might find in a laptop, and there's two of them there. The one on the bottom is flat, and that one's a perfectly good battery, but the one on top, the bottom one's there just for reference. The one on top is the bulging one that you have to be careful about. The middle one is a corroded button battery. And then the one on the right, the top one is actually looking pretty good, but the lower battery is, you can see it's speckled. It's a darker color, right? And all of these DOT has on their brochure on their website as examples of DDR batteries that you want to be particularly careful of. So when it comes to the e-liquids, the main goal for storing them safely is to prevent exposure to the nicotine and prevent releases to the environment of the nicotine. So again, how do you achieve those goals? And well, in both cases, the answer is containment. And again, pretty easily achieved. If you've got pods or cartridges that have become separated from the e-cigarette, just place all those pods and cartridges together in a clear plastic bag that's sealed. There's no need to use individual bags in this case. You're just containing the nicotine, the liquid, from leaking out and from being dermally absorbed. Just be careful though, if you've got those pods or cartridges that are actually attached to the e-cigarette that have the battery, then that's when you want to make sure that they go in the individual separate clear plastic bags. And I really like to think that I don't need this slide, but I have seen recommendations online for people to rinse their pods or their tanks to remove the nicotine. That is a bad idea. No drugs should go down the drain, including nicotine. As the water treatment folks like to say, there are only 3 things that should go down the drain. They call it the 3 Ps: poop, pee, and paper. No nicotine, please don't rinse it, or any other drugs for that matter. All right, so now we're going to look at a few photos and critique some storage methods. So here's, I think it's a household hazardous waste collection actually. On the top photo with the guy with the thumbs up, I like it. He's got apron, he's got protective gloves. But I think what could be better in this case is it seems like a lot of e-cigarettes are in baggies together. It doesn't look like they're taped. It's possible the terminals aren't exposed in the styles of e-cigarettes, but just to be safe, I would like to see each e-cigarette in its own individual bag. Here's another example. In this case, the batteries do appear to be taped, so that's good. But it looks like it might be Scotch tape. It's hard to tell. And you really want to use a non-conducting tape, electrical tape, duct tape, or packing tape. And this is a new trend that I've heard about at schools that worries me a little bit. I think the intentions are very good. They're, kind of a mailbox type solution for, schools are putting up on walls that students can, put their vapes in there discreetly, anonymously, and nobody knows. The thing that worries me, right, is that there's a potential for fire if battery terminals are in contact with each other or with metal. And look, what the box appears to be made of metal. So if there are any terminals that are kind of exposed and it comes into contact with the box, that's not a good combination. Okay, so the last thing I'm going to cover is recycling of lithium batteries. So the good news is lithium batteries are recyclable. Again, do not put those batteries in the recycling bin to get them recycled. The batteries need to be sent to a battery recycler, or a battery collector who will then ultimately get them to a recycler. The recyclers, however, are only accepting batteries that have been removed from e-cigarettes. They do not accept entire post-consumer e-cigarettes for recycling. Now, the problem with that is that, as we mentioned earlier, depending on the style of the e-cigarettes, the batteries in these cigarettes may not be easily removable, which is going to really inhibit recycling of those particular e-cigarettes. So some models of e-cigarettes have batteries that are in fact designed to have the battery removed and separated. So with a Juul, this is a Juul, you just pop off the pod, and there's the long skinny part is the battery, the pod is the replaceable part with the e-liquid, right? So once you pop that off, separated from the e-liquids in the pod, and battery recyclers will accept these batteries that have been removed. This is an old style, older generation of e-cigarettes, the cig-alike ones. They can be unscrewed. The batteries can be unscrewed. Again, the battery recyclers will accept those. But unfortunately, in other models of e-cigarettes, the batteries are not designed to be removed. These are usually referred to as the disposable or the single-use e-cigarettes, and they're particularly popular among the kids right now because it's the only way to get flavored e-liquids. In this case, if they're not designed to have removable batteries, we discourage anyone from disassembling the e-cigarettes in order to recycle the lithium battery. If you do that, the chances are you can damage the battery, and the damaged battery is the most dangerous kind of battery. It's more likely to catch fire. So I applaud the recycling, but only the ones where they're actually intended to be removed. Finally, we do encourage generators to explore commercially available options for recycling all their batteries as universal waste, not just the ones from e-cigarettes, right? If you do that, then the batteries don't have to be counted toward determining your RCRA generator category. The less hazardous waste you generate, the fewer regs there are. we encourage you to explore those battery collection boxes. Sometimes they're free, they're pre-addressed to the recycler, postage paid, and DOT compliant. Again, if you use one of these battery recycling collection boxes, do not put the DDR batteries in with the other batteries for recycling. And this is my contact information, and I look forward to your questions after Don's presentation.
Thank you very much. I am going to now make Don the presenter so that, let's see, did we lose? There he is. Okay, very good.
How does that look, Martin?
Looks great.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Martin. So I'm honored to have this opportunity to share my experiences. It's a very, very dynamic industry. I've been studying it since 2013 and have witnessed both the merchandise and the retail outlets evolve immensely. As Kristin elaborated, RCRA is the federal legislation governing waste generated by the vaping and other industries. States can establish their own programs. After doing just that, Florida chose to adopt large portions of the federal regulations into its administrative code. As mentioned previously, state regulations must be at least as stringent as federal regulations, but they can be more stringent. In regards to used oil filters, mercury-containing lamps, weekly inspection logs, and BSQG disposal records, we are more strict. In the mid-1980s, Florida enacted some provisions under its public health laws requiring the establishment of county-level SQG programs. There are three main requirements. Assess the facilities in your county and build an assessment roll of facilities that likely generate regulated wastes. We use the term facility because it's not just businesses. We also inspect various military and other governmental entities like public works departments, wastewater treatment plants, fleet management facilities. Then secondly, we notify these facilities about the program, explain generator status and other details. And then we do site visits and verify the waste streams they generate and their storage and disposal practices. All of this with the goal to verify/inspect 20% of our assessment roll each year. During these verifications, we tour the facility, ask lots and lots of questions, and review documents, all the while educating them. While most programs are housed either in a solid waste department or an environmental management department or perhaps public works, some are in the departments of health. In some of our rural counties, they give the duties to their firefighters or even in one case, their sheriff's office. We all enter this data into a Florida Department of Environmental Protection, FDEP, state database specifically for the SQG program. It stands at almost 250,000 facilities. Certainly not all of these are active, but these numbers are added to daily. Very rural counties may have very few facilities, while others have many thousands. Here in Pinellas, over on the Gulf Coast, we have almost 1 million residents, and we are the most densely populated county in the state. Other counties have the benefit of a business license database from which to build their assessment rolls. They know where their auto repair shops, their metal platers, their dry cleaners are. Without that advantage, we've built our assessment roll over the years rather piecemeal. Using the SIC, Standard Industrial Classification Codes, as a basis, our assessment role currently has this profile. There's a good deal of manufacturing. Many of these are small job shops with less than 10 employees. There's lots of healthcare facilities of all sizes. Vape shops, pharmacies, big box stores, those would all fall into the wholesale retail sector. And then services general, that would include the hundreds upon hundreds of auto repair shops in our county. So we call our section here at Solid Waste Business Waste Assessment, because now we collect data on more than just the regulated waste streams required by the state's SQG program. Whereas SQG will always be our core program, Business Waste Assessment has evolved and grown to include other programs. Our online search tool with reuse, recycle, and disposal options for a myriad of materials, including e-cigs. We partner with the FDEP to promote best management practices at marinas. And we have a rather unique program to encourage charities to recycle and divert most of their would-be waste. Okay, so let's get down to the subject at hand. Where can you purchase e-cigs and e-liquids? Well, lots of places. Strip malls, chain retail outlets or gas stations, kiosks in malls, flea markets. As a result of our initial round of vaping industry inspections back in 2014-2015, we identified what I termed the 5 tiers of complexity. This is tier 1, strictly retail. Tier 2, the lounge. Some vape stores invite their customers to come in and linger. Tier 3, rebuilding. So these devices contain coils and wicks, and after a certain number of uses, these require replacement. I was really quite taken aback early on when I stepped behind one counter to find a drill press and a professional mechanic's tool chest. Tier 4, mixing. In the little back rooms of these vape shops, you'd often find a card table, lots of little plastic bottles, some flavorings, and a jug of nicotine down there under the table by the date. The measuring and transfer device was often an eyedropper. The image on the right is actually from a bicycle sales and repair shop that was mixing and selling e-liquids on the side. Both images are from 2015, the time I refer to as the Wild West days. And lastly, tier 5, actual clean room, pharmaceutical-like manufacturing operations. Our initial findings revealed widespread ignorance of RCRA, and it didn't seem to even dawn on shop staff that there might be regulations concerning what you can and what you cannot discard into the trash or pour down the drain. Thus, we developed an educational brochure incorporating the phrase electronic nicotine delivery system, or ENDS. Fast forward a year or so, the Food and Drug Administration deemed that these are tobacco products, and vape shops can be classified as and regulated as a retailer, a manufacturer, or both. Among the FDA requirements on the manufacturer's side, lots of paperwork for each and every product, and health warning labels on the packaging. On the retail side, no sales to minors, no free samples, and any advertisements have to have health warning statements. I wondered, what would be the impact of the deeming rule? Well, we had baseline data on 52 facilities. This is what our initial landscape looked like. The vast majority were those simple retail-only operations, but there was a good amount of rebuilding and mixing going on. So of those original 52 in our database, we found that 18, about a third of them, were out of business. Now, many new ones have sprung up in that void, but we had 34 for comparison pre and post deeming rule. Our results, well, tier 1 had exact same numbers. While the lounges had quadrupled, the rebuilders had vanished, mixers still lingered, and a bona fide manufacturer opened up here. During these inspections of retailers and wholesalers in general, we always ask these open-ended questions. This is how products become wastes, whether at a paint store, a pharmacy, or a vape shop. These were the answers we got to our spill response query. And mind you, we'd been in all of these facilities and educating them a year or two previously. Only a small percentage heeded our advice. So fast forward again a handful of years, and what does the landscape look like currently? For many vape shops, diversification would be the best descriptor. Many shops now offer herbal teas, kratom, and kava drinks, other botanicals I've never heard of. They offer drink specials and snacks. A serving counter and bar like this is a very typical scene now in many vape shops. The lounges are very much in vogue. Come in and set a spell. Most are filled with games. They have all the classics: Monopoly, Battleship, pull out that twister mat and have some fun. Some do trivia night or have an open mic night. Some of these retail outlets have morphed into more or less social clubs. The merchandise found in vape shops has also greatly diversified. Few, if any, vape shops just sell e-cigs and e-liquid these days. Butane and butane torches on the left. Glassware, some very elaborate and expensive, and other accessories. You really never know what you're going to find. Diversification to other medicinals. These products may not be regulated under RCRA, but in fact, during that initial round of inspections in the Wild West days, one of the chains actually told us that they were establishing brick and mortar outlets with an eye to the future as becoming marijuana dispensaries. Well, that vision is beginning to come to fruition. As Michael alluded to, we've witnessed a continuing shift in the delivery devices, from mods like the Dreadnought on the left to disposables. And I'm told by store staff that the older vapors often still use the mods, while the younger vapors almost exclusively purchase the disposables. Some of these with as many as 7,000 puffs. So we end all of our inspections with a single-page report form detailing any compliance issues. We provide a copy of this and discuss solutions during our exit interview. These are typical of vape shop inspections. We document both our discussions and educational materials provided. Now, the first step to properly managing hazardous waste is to try not to generate it in the first place. And inventory management is the key. Don't buy more than you can sell in a timely fashion. apply a first in, first out philosophy, and consider not accepting returns. Another strategy is to sell at discount. Back in the day, about half the products had expiration dates, but today not so many. Some have a best if used by date, and most will have a production date. I'm told that juice that is 1 or 2 years old will have a stale taste. It really doesn't age like fine wine. I've done a bunch of inspections preparing for this update, and almost all of them had some discounted products. I've even seen dollar bins. Unfortunately, a number of outlets are still discarding these regulated wastes improperly. This initially was a Tier 4 mixer. Then they actually became an FDA regulated manufacturer. Then they morphed into a botanical tea bar and were winding down manufacturing operations. I requested disposal documentation, and I recently went back to follow up, and poof, phone number was disconnected. The business was not incorporated, so I couldn't track them through our division of corporations. We'll likely never know what happened to those hazardous wastes. Several of our vape shops box up their leaks and duds. These will presumably go back to a distributor or manufacturer for credit. So we decided to swim upstream and visit one of those distributors. We found aisles and aisles of boxes and boxes of e-cigs, all disposables, no juice. You'll notice the ubiquitous labels. At this distributor, all those ENDS were coming from China, imported to one of 2 large distributors on either of Florida's coasts, then to regional distributors like this one, and finally to the retailers. This particular distributor specialized in supplying gas station convenience stores. Our county tanks program reports that we have 325 active gas stations in the county, and I would wager that many of those have convenience stores. I had visited this vape shop, one in a chain of shops, the previous December, and we discussed improper waste disposal. A follow-up visit revealed this improvement of their waste management practices. More recently, different store, same vape shop chain. Some of those are 30 or even 60 milliliter vials. By Kristin's back of the envelope math, they don't get more than a couple of dozen of those before they reach the accumulation limits and become LQG. The manager of this store couldn't tell me what was going to happen to these. After some assistance from the FDEP Southwest District, this chain of vape shops now more formally documents their consolidation with a monthly log sheet. So this is at one of a handful of retail outlets for a local 5-tier FDA registered LQG e-juice manufacturer. By all indication, now someone at the plant makes monthly pickups from these outlets. Some vape shops accumulate wastes as a convenience for their customers, but they often don't know what to do with it. This is from an inspection of a vape shop just last week. He said he's called, quote unquote, all the cities, he's got a chain of shops, and no one could tell him what to do. Well, I'm encouraging him to attend our next business collection event. Here in Pinellas, we hold these monthly and have both a hazardous waste contractor and an electronics contractor on site. As you can see, the costs are modest. This vape shop actually spent more properly disposing of their fluorescent lamps, going for recycling. So proper management of that acute hazardous waste isn't going to put a mom and pop vape shop out of business, at least not here in Pinellas. And we offer to our residents free disposal of a wide variety of household hazardous wastes. We do get a handful of e-cigs each month from our residents. So as Kristin just stressed, the discarded device has a battery and has nicotine, or at least nicotine residue. Some HHWs attempt to disassemble and segregate those components safely. Jennifer Volkman of the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has delved into this and literally made a science of the practice. Piggybacking off of Jennifer's research, these are snippets from Leon County, Florida's HHW SOP on how to safely handle different types of wastes that citizens bring in. They recently added this e-cig SOP to that document. And for each of those device types on the right, it gives detailed step-by-step procedures. Well, here's my last little ditty. The other day I saw a pickup truck pulling a highly decorated trailer labeled so-and-so's mobile smoke shop. I've been studying this industry for going on 10 years now, and indeed, it just keeps getting curiouser and curiouser. There's some contact info. Thank you again for this opportunity.
And thank you very much, Don. Appreciate your presentation. With that, we're now going to go to the question and answer part. I might ask the panelists to put their cameras back on so we can see them. And there's been a fair amount of questions coming in. Some of them were asked multiple times, so I'm gonna, and I assume it's EPA, but the other panelists might have some views on this, but at least 4 different attendees have noted that facilities, regional facilities in Illinois, facilities in New England that do household hazardous waste collections do not want to take vape pens and e-cigarettes. Some were told that they would start doing it, then they haven't. In other places where the experience has been that they're not getting a lot of household hazardous waste operators taking it. Any advice to offer if you're confronting that situation in a particular state?
That's interesting. I reached out to my own household hazardous waste collection program probably a couple of years ago now. I live in Fairfax County in Virginia, and I noticed, on their website, they have a list of things they do accept and a list of things they don't accept, but they didn't have e-cigarettes on there at all. So I actually reached out to them and I said, hey, you guys accept e-cigarettes? And he said, that's the first time anybody's ever asked me that question. Let me get back to you. And literally within a week, he said, yep, we're going to accept them from now on. And our vendor said, like Don said, not a big price increase, right? We already are, household hazardous waste is already accepting hazardous waste. It's not a big deal. Just put it in with their other hazardous waste.
So Kristin, when you called him, did you explain they had lithium-ion batteries in there, or did that come up in the conversation? Do you remember? Because I wonder if that changes the dynamic a little bit. If you call and say, hey, I've got this e-cigarette, it's got a battery that's hazardous waste, versus saying I've got an e-cigarette, and they just think about, I just wonder if that changes the dynamic.
He knows of their hazardous waste. Yeah, I recall that he knew about the nicotine. I don't remember having a discussion about the batteries. But yeah, so you might try approaching them and ask them to ask their vendor, if their hazardous waste vendor, if they'll take them. I mean, a lot of the counties I think use the same vendors for these household hazardous waste collection programs?
Okay. A similar, you know, a related theme, I should say. We got several questions asking whether EPA is pursuing or whether anybody on the panel knows about states that are looking at EPR types of opportunities or take back programs to collect e-cigarettes and vaping pens.
EPA does not have the authority to have an EPR for anything.
Okay.
So not it.
Okay.
All the
fair.
EPR legislation's happening at the state and county level.
Okay.
I'm not aware of any for e-cigarettes at this point.
Mhm. By the way, I need to repeat an announcement here that I made earlier and make a new one that I didn't make at the introduction. We've had several questioners asking, you know, is the session being recorded? Yes, it is. It will be made available on the NEWMOA website within a few days. And so, you know, this will be an available resource. Secondly, our colleagues at NERC have let us know that this session is eligible for professional recyclers of Pennsylvania continuing education credits. So I just wanted to make sure that anybody from that organization in Pennsylvania is aware of that. We did get a question from Michael Nork, who asked about in the household hazardous waste collection programs, some that he's dealt with, they're asking for e-cigarettes to be dismantled so that the liquids are handled separately from the batteries. You know, do you have any guidance on, you know, how household or residential generators can handle this for units that aren't easily disassembled? And then
Don't disassemble it if it's not meant to be disassembled.
okay, and then there's a related question from Kristin de Apolloni about if it can't be separated, what's the guidance on estimating the nicotine and the weight of the battery if you're dealing with basically one unit?
The same would hold true, right? I mean, you just have to kind of add them together. But what we said is that an e-cigarette is basically a container of nicotine. You only have to count. You don't only have to count the nicotine towards the acute hazardous waste threshold. You don't have to count the weight of the container.
Okay. Then Michael also asked a question about, you know, the guidance about putting the lithium batteries in a bucket of water and express some, you know, asked whether or not the lithium in the water, doesn't it react and produce a gas that would be a source of concern?
So let Patrick handle it.
I can probably take that one for Kristin. My name is Patrick Wise. I work in the same office as Kristin at EPA headquarters. I'm on our batteries team, so I might have a little bit more familiarity with this. In terms of water mixing with lithium-ion batteries and potentially producing a gas, there is some truth to that, but the water vapor in air is enough for that to happen in general. So really any battery that ignites is going to produce that toxic gas. Or that, I guess, hazardous gas is probably the better term for that. So I wouldn't, you know, use that as a reason not to put it in a bucket of water. That's if it's a lithium-ion battery. You know, you can also do a bucket of sand if it's DDR. Really, the idea is just to keep it from, if it were to ignite, keep the flames from spraying to anything else. You know, with batteries, a lot of the times we see if you have like a bin full of batteries or you have a battery with multiple cells, if one ignites, that makes everything hot, it damages the other batteries, then they ignite, then the next ones ignite, and then you have a fire that's completely out of control very quickly. And so isolating a damaged battery that might ignite in a way that it's not going to spread that heat toward other batteries is really the key kind of management strategy for preventing it from becoming like a real catastrophe.
Okay, thank you for that. We got a question about heating coils from Paige Wilson, that if you can separate the heating coils from the other elements of the unit, Is that addressed, do you address that by treating the heating coils as e-waste or some other form of waste?
So if you have managed to disassemble your e-cigarette into its various components, they all do have, coils, as Don was mentioning. And trying to remember, it's been a while since I've looked at what those metals might be. I mean, they're recyclable. I don't think any of them would be hazardous, but the metals could be recyclable. I imagine recyclers would accept those if they've already been taken out.
Okay.
I have spoken to a recycler or company that accepted a lot of pre-consumer e-cigarettes. So not post-consumer, pre-consumer cigarettes, to dismantle them and separate them into their various components for recycling. And they said it was extremely time-consuming work, labor-intensive, and it ended up being more expensive than hazardous waste management. The particular client wanted to do it because they wanted to recycle their e-cigarettes, but it's not a very economically viable choice for most.
Okay.
Those rebuilding images that I showed, the wire actually is nichrome wire, nickel chromium wire. But today, I don't see anybody doing that in the shops. If you're going to change out that unit, it's a modular unit with both the coil and the wick. And in some cases, there's even ceramic coils out there. So again, these devices are continuing to evolve. But back in the day, we recommended scrap metal exemption.
Okay. Eric McConnell asked, Kristin, could you speak about containers or bottles that held PO75 liquid and are RCRA empty?
Yeah, so it depends upon the type of container. So under the pharmaceuticals rule, we revised the definition of RCRA empty for containers that hold pharmaceuticals. Nicotine is considered a pharmaceutical. So if you have an e-cigarette that had nicotine in it, basically it's an acute listed waste. There are 4 different types of containers that we talk about in the pharmaceuticals rule. An e-cigarette would be considered an other. So that the 4 are kind of unit dose containers, syringes, IV bags, and then other. So an e-cigarette would be considered other. And with a P-listed waste, there is no definition of empty. If you have, vials, like Don showed those pictures of the vials, those would fit in the first category. And so if depending upon their size, they would fit in the first category. And they just basically have to be emptied by kind of standard means. They don't have to be triple rinsed.
Kristin, we got a question here from somebody saying, they want to make sure they have your contact information. For the folks that said that, we are going to put the slides up again along with the materials. So, and I know Kristin's contact information is at the end of that. So we'll try to post that as, sooner rather than later. This is a question, I think, for Don. How is the county SQG funded in Florida?
Every county's funded differently. Those counties that have a business license often have a surcharge for certain industries. So if you're a metal plater, you'll get a surcharge. And up front, you'll get information about SQGs, RCRA, you're going to be inspected sometime, expect it. Other counties, it's actually an unfunded mandate. So we have to figure out how to fund it ourselves. So those counties without licenses, probably a number of methods. Here at Department of Solid Waste, we're an enterprise fund. So we have a waste energy plant, a landfill, we have revenue streams and expenses. And so our program just operates within our enterprise fund.
Okay. There was a question, I don't know if Mitchell's still on the line, but Mitchell Colbert asked, first of all, he was saying that, referring to these units as disposable is a problem in and of itself, and they should be called other things, which, I know the panelists, given everything you're dealing with, would not have an issue with. But he asked about if cannabis is treated differently under RCRA than tobacco, because he said we've been talking a lot about tobacco products, and he also cited an example in California. There's a law that prevents cannabis companies from calling their vapes disposable and requiring consumer education. So, I don't know if what is the regulatory treatment if it's a cannabis vape versus a tobacco vape?
Oh, this is really tricky always. It almost always comes up when I give an e-cigarette presentation, but federally in particular, it's tricky because cannabis, of course, is still a controlled substance under DEA federally. So you might have DEA problems, right, with the cannabis aspect. But as far as RCRA goes, as far as I know, there's no form of cannabis that is a hazardous waste. But I also have not looked into it very carefully because it's not something we usually deal with. So I'm sure one day somebody's going to come to me and tell me about a version that ends up being hazardous waste.
Okay.
Don, you've inspected a lot of these stores. Have you run across any versions that are hazardous waste?
The only thing I can say to that, there's a lot of CBD oil out there, and I was able to pull up one SDS where it would have the ignitability characteristic. It had a low flash. Most of them were high flash, but one of them indeed was a low flash.
Okay. We got a question from Natalie Reese. How does a school send e-cigarettes to an LQG through the mail? Kenneth.
Yeah, so there's a different set of regulations under the PACT Act. What does PACT stand for? Prevention.
Prevent all cigarette trafficking.
Thank you. Yes, the PACT Act would prevent them probably from mailing it. E-cigarettes, tobacco can't be mailed. There are exceptions, of course, but they probably wouldn't qualify for one of those exceptions, so they'd have to bring it there, right? So the idea is, though, is that you're bringing it to an LQG that's under the same ownership that's close by, so like, within your school district, for example. So you'd bring it there. You wouldn't send it through the mail. You can use a private carrier. UPS and FedEx have said they won't accept it. USPS has the PACT Act, so you'd have to find some other private carrier, but the best bet is just to bring it there.
I don't know which panelist wants to take this on. Maybe all of you have an idea on this, but what would you recommend as a safe but still discreet way for students to discard vapes in schools?
So, you could do a kind of situation where they have, like at Home Depot, where they have a container and they provide bags to put the batteries in to put it into the container so that they're isolated. It's not ideal. I'd rather have like a no questions asked kind of place where you could drop them off, because if you've ever been to Home Depot and you see one of those, they're almost inevitably out of bags, plastic bags to put the batteries in, right? And so people still put them in there, of course, even though the plastic bag isn't there. So I could envision that happening in a school as well. So
yeah, I mean, I think this, yeah, Kristin, that aligns with like our view that that the idea that the approach to getting youth not to use, and high school students not to use e-cigarettes isn't through punishment, right? Like, and so absolutely, like if a young adult or if a youth's willing to like give up their product, like no questions asked, like no punishment policy would be ideal in that situation. Like the goal here isn't to punish kids, it's to help them no longer be addicted to nicotine.
Okay. We had a question from Angela Polichov, who says they're a transfer station in New Hampshire. Most of the e-cigs we're seeing are the Elf Bar disposable variety. How is it recommended that we are supposed to dispose? We've been sending them out in battery recycling.
Yeah, so I haven't talked to one directly in a while, but last time I kind of surveyed the battery recyclers about this. They don't want full e-cigarettes. They only want the batteries. Like they're battery recyclers, not e-cigarette recyclers. So they don't want the Elf Bar or any other version of an e-cigarette where the battery can't be removed, and just recycle the battery.
I see. Okay. We got a comment. Thank you for the great presentations. And they ask about the bags. Can something more environmentally friendly be used to bag the units versus Ziploc baggies? Are compostable bags safe to use? Vapes are a bad waste stream. Can we avoid making it worse with single-use plastics?
Yeah, so I don't know that there's been any studies into the efficacy of like compostable bags in terms of preventing a spark or a connection between the terminals for batteries that are all sitting in a bin together. I think fundamentally the thing that you're trying to do is just prevent contacts, right? 'Cause it's flow of electricity that's really the big issue when you're thinking about keeping everything separated. So if you wanted to try to use like paper bags or compostable bags, I think it would work. And like Kristin talked about, you can also tape the terminals, which probably uses a little bit less material. But I also think, like a lot of things with the environment, there's kind of weighting going on where you have to consider the potential environmental harm of a fire caused by a lithium-ion battery or a vape device against the plastic waste that is admittedly generated by bagging these things. So it's good that we're thinking about it and talking about it, but just dueling priorities.
Yeah, sir, I agree with Pat. I mean, certainly the taping is going to give you less waste than putting in a Ziploc bag. Right?
Okay. Got a question here about how many devices, we covered this, but how many devices could a school collect before exceeding the 2.2 pound limit?
Well, it depends upon the device, right? So that's why I just kind of did some back of the envelope calculations. And I did it a while ago with Juul. Well, Juul was still very popular, and Juul does not really sell to youth anymore because they can't sell flavors anymore in their pods, right? So it's a little out of date, but that's the one I use. They had about a milliliter of e-liquid in each one, right? So if you're counting just the weight of the e-liquid, then it's about 1,000 joules to get to a kilogram.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Right, Michael, you were making the faces. Did I say something wrong about Juul and the pods?
I just don't think we know that because Juul has done away with, because the Juul products are no longer being used by youth or getting sold by youth anymore. I think, Juul has stopped selling some flavors, but not all flavors. But that really wasn't the point of the question. Your answer was about calculation.
And we received a question again from, I think it might have been from Mitchell, or it might have been more than one person. Yeah, airports, are they, you indicated that schools, are not eligible for the household hazardous waste exemption. Similarly, for airports, they're managing their wastes, in accordance with the same set of rules.
Yeah, I don't. So yeah, I mean, an airport would not be eligible for the household hazardous waste exemption. Unless it's in your checked luggage, they're not going to take it out, right? You can bring it on board the plane, right? So if you're going through TSA, they're not going to confiscate it from you. You just can't put it in your checked luggage, and if they find it there, they're going to confiscate it, and they would have to manage this hazardous waste.
Okay. Okay. Well, I think I think we've covered our questions here and we're at 2:25. So I wanted to, once again, I'm going to scroll here and just make sure there's not a last minute question that came in right as we're leaving in the last second. But, and if you give me a moment, I'll be able to do that. But, so I want to thank you once again for a terrific presentation. We had 300 people on the line today, reflecting the importance of the topic and the desire for information. And you know, I know from the number of questions that you fielded here after your presentations, you can see it's a very lively topic, and people are still trying to figure out whether it's the regional issue of finding household hazardous waste entities that will take the materials, to the specific questions about how to handle the different types of products. But I really would like to thank all 4 of our panelists for a very thoughtful presentation. And once again, we will be posting this recording and their materials. And we look forward to continuing to work with all of you on this and other topics. And once again, thanks to our presenters, and I hope everybody has a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.